Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that greed is the thickest, most suffocating substance on earth. The day I realized my own flesh and blood had discarded me like trash was the day the father they knew died, and the architect of their ruin was born. My name is Arthur. For 68 years, I believed in the simple, unbreakable contract of family. I believed that if you provided, protected, and poured your soul into building a foundation for your children, they would stand on it with gratitude and respect. I spent 40 years building a commercial logistics company from absolute scratch. I started with a single, rusted-out delivery truck with a transmission that slipped violently in third gear. I drove 18 hours a day, hauling heavy freight across state lines, sleeping upright in the cab, eating cold meals from gas stations, all so my son, Robert, and my daughter, Susan, would never know the bitter sting of poverty. I even brought my younger brother, Greg, into the fold, giving him a high-paying executive position when he could not hold down a job anywhere else. Over 4 decades, that one unreliable truck became a massive fleet of over 200 premium vehicles. We owned sprawling distribution centers. We controlled lucrative, multi-million-dollar shipping contracts. I built an empire of diesel and steel, and I handed them the keys to the kingdom on a silver platter. But a silver platter is incredibly easy to steal when the man holding it is suddenly paralyzed. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A minor stroke. One moment I was sitting at my heavy mahogany desk, reviewing our quarterly financial projections, and the next, the entire right side of my face went completely numb. The room tilted violently, the hardwood floor rushing up to meet me. I woke up 48 hours later in a hospital bed, pinned beneath the glaring, sterile white lights of the intensive care unit. My mind was awake, terrified, and screaming for answers, but my physical body refused to obey my commands. My tongue felt like a heavy lead weight in my mouth. When I tried to ask the nurse what had happened, I could only manage slurred, disjointed, pathetic sounds. That is exactly when they came into my room. Robert, Susan, and Greg. They did not rush to my bedside with tears welling in their eyes. They did not hold my trembling hand and tell me everything was going to be okay. They walked in with the crisp, cold, calculated efficiency of corporate raiders circling a dying company. Robert was holding a thick manila folder tucked tightly under his arm. Susan was holding a fancy gold fountain pen, the exact same pen I had proudly gifted her for her college graduation. Greg hovered silently by the heavy wooden door, acting as the lookout, his eyes darting nervously down the hospital hallway. I did not know it then, but Greg had been whispering poison into Robert's ear for a decade, planting deep seeds of resentment and entitlement that were finally blooming in my moment of absolute physical weakness. Robert leaned closely over my bed. He smelled of expensive, imported cologne, purchased entirely with the generous salary I paid him. He spoke in a hushed, highly urgent tone. He told me the company was in a state of sheer panic. He claimed the board of directors was aggressively threatening to freeze all of our operating accounts because the chief executive officer was officially incapacitated. He said our primary suppliers were demanding immediate, full payment, and the whole business was merely days away from total, unrecoverable collapse. It was a lie. A brilliant, meticulously calculated lie designed specifically for a man whose brain was still swollen and desperately struggling to process reality. Susan stepped forward, her face stretched into a tight mask of false sympathy. She gently stroked my forehead, a gesture so utterly hollow and rehearsed that it made my skin crawl beneath the thin hospital sheets. She gently placed the thick stack of papers on my chest and slipped the heavy gold pen into my shaking, uncoordinated right hand. She whispered sweetly that these were simply temporary medical directives and emergency operational authorizations. Just a legal formality. She promised me, just to keep the facility lights on and the freight trucks moving while I focused entirely on resting and getting better. I was profoundly disoriented, physically exhausted, and desperately trying to trust the very people I loved most in the world. With immense, painful effort, my right hand shaking violently against the clipboard. I scrawled my messy signature on the dotted lines they eagerly pointed to. I signed page after page, my vision blurring from the strain and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. I truly thought I was saving my life's work. I was actually signing my own financial death warrant. I was unknowingly signing away my controlling ownership shares, completely transferring my personal assets, and granting Robert total, irrevocable legal power of attorney over my entire existence. The precise moment the final signature was complete, the atmosphere in the sterile room shifted instantly. The faux familial concern vanished like smoke. Susan swiftly snatched the papers away, blowing on the wet ink to dry it faster. Robert gave Greg a sharp, triumphant nod. They did not linger. They did not even say a proper goodbye. They simply turned their backs on me and walked rapidly out of the room, leaving me completely alone with the steady, mocking, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. It took 6 agonizing weeks in a specialized neurological rehabilitation facility for me to slowly regain my speech and my basic motor skills. 6 brutal weeks of intense physical therapy, punishing my aging body to the absolute limit just to relearn how to walk properly. During that entire time, the silence from my family was absolutely deafening. Every single one of my phone calls to Robert went straight to his automated voicemail. Susan never replied to a single one of my text messages. Greg's personal cell phone number was officially disconnected. When I tried to order a small, modest bouquet of flowers for the dedicated nurses who had cared for me so well, my primary credit card was brutally declined. I foolishly brushed it off as a simple banking error, assuming it was an automatic security freeze due to account inactivity. My singular focus was entirely on getting home, getting back to my corner office, and taking the firm reins of my company once again. On the crisp morning of my official discharge, I had to politely ask the facility administrator to call me a commercial cab. I gave the driver the address of my family estate, a sprawling, beautifully landscaped, gated mansion I had purchased outright 20 years ago. It was my ultimate sanctuary, the massive physical manifestation of all my decades of hard work and sacrifice. The yellow cab pulled up to the tall wrought iron gates. They were securely closed. I confidently punched my personal access code into the digital keypad, but the heavy metal doors did not move an inch. The small screen flashed a harsh red error message, indicating my code had been permanently deleted. Deeply confused, I paid the driver with the very last $50 bill I had in my leather wallet and told him I would simply walk up the long driveway myself. I heavily hauled myself over the side pedestrian gate, my legs still shaking slightly from the exertion, and made the long, slow trek up the winding paved road toward the main house. The late afternoon sky was turning a bruised purple, threatening a heavy rainstorm. As I rounded the final sweeping bend and the grand white columns of my front porch came into clear view, my heart abruptly stopped in my chest. The massive house was completely dark, but that was not what froze the blood in my veins. Sitting right there on the pristine cobblestone walkway, just outside the massive custom oak front doors, were 3 cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes. I stumbled forward, my breath violently catching in my dry throat. I reached the door and fumbled frantically for my keychain. I slid the familiar brass key into the cylinder, but it stopped dead halfway in. It would not turn. I pulled it out and tried again, my hands shaking just as terribly as they had in the hospital bed. The locks had been professionally changed, entirely new. Shiny silver hardware gleamed mercilessly under the dim porch light. Slowly, feeling a sickening pit open in my stomach, I turned around and looked down at the concrete sidewalk. I painfully knelt on the cold stone and opened the first box. Inside were some of my oldest, most worn-out work clothes from my early days. The second box contained a few pairs of scuffed shoes and my basic shaving kit. The third box held a small handful of framed photographs, mostly old, faded pictures of my late wife, things my children clearly assigned absolute zero monetary value to. They had packed up my entire existence. 40 years of providing, 40 years of meticulously building a legacy, 40 years of loving them unconditionally, completely reduced to 3 pathetic cardboard boxes left out on the concrete like household garbage waiting for the morning sanitation truck. The rain finally began to fall, cold and sharp against my weathered face. I stood completely alone in the creeping dark, shivering violently in front of the multi-million-dollar house I legally owned, locked out of the very life I built with my bare hands. They had viciously taken everything. My money, my company, my beautiful home, my hard-earned dignity. They truly thought they had left me with absolutely nothing, assuming I was just a broken, irrelevant old man, ready to quietly fade away into the gutter without a fight. But as I stood right there in the freezing, pouring rain, staring blankly at those cardboard boxes, the initial crushing shock finally burned away, rapidly replaced by a cold, searing, diamond-hard clarity. They had indeed stripped me bare, but in their arrogant haste, they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. As a very specific, highly dangerous thought began to take firm root in the back of my mind regarding a dormant offshore financial account I had never mentioned to a single living soul, I realized they had actually left me with the one thing they should have feared the most. They left me with nothing left to lose. The hardest part of hitting rock bottom is not the sudden, violent impact of the fall. It is the agonizing, suffocating silence that follows when you realize absolutely no one is coming to pull you out of the rubble. I dragged my 3 flimsy cardboard boxes down the wet pavement, the cold rain soaking through my thin jacket and chilling my aging bones to the marrow. Every step away from the wrought iron gates of my sprawling estate felt like carrying a boulder on my chest. I walked for 2 miles, my right leg burning and dragging slightly from the lingering effects of the stroke, until I found a dilapidated motel sitting off a lonely stretch of the state highway. The neon vacancy sign flickered violently, buzzing like an angry hornet in the damp night air. I walked into the cramped, foul-smelling lobby and approached the scratched plexiglass window. I reached into my soaked leather wallet and pulled out the few crumpled bills I had left to my name. It took exactly $45 to secure a room for the night. I handed the money over, my hands shaking with a mixture of physical exhaustion and deep, burning humiliation. The room itself was a nightmare of stained carpet, peeling yellow wallpaper, and the heavy, stale stench of cheap cigarettes. I sat heavily on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest beneath my weight. I did not bother turning on the television or unpacking my pathetic cardboard boxes. I just sat there in the dim, flickering light from the parking lot, staring at the cracked plaster on the wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my children's betrayal. The next morning, the true, horrifying scope of their theft became crystal clear. I walked halfway across town to the main branch of my primary bank, hoping against hope that perhaps they had only frozen the corporate accounts and left my personal finances intact. I sat down in the plush leather chair opposite a young, overly cheerful branch manager who had eagerly taken my deposits for years. When he pulled up my profile on his computer screen, his polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomfortable pity. He quietly explained that just 3 days after my stroke, Robert and Susan had walked into that exact branch holding the notarized power of attorney documents I had foolishly signed in my hospital bed. Legally, they had absolute authorization. Systematically, ruthlessly, and without a single ounce of hesitation, they had drained everything. My checking accounts, my personal savings, my robust emergency funds, and my long-term investment portfolios were completely liquidated and transferred into a newly formed trust that I had absolutely no access to. They had even closed my safety deposit box, taking the heirloom jewelry that had belonged to my late wife. The bank manager softly pushed a printed ledger across the polished desk. The balance at the bottom of the page read $0.00. I walked out of the bank with nothing but the clothes on my back and a sickening pit in my stomach. I was entirely bankrupt. The man who had employed hundreds of people, who had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to local charities, who had built a massive commercial logistics empire from a single rusted truck, was now entirely reliant on a meager monthly Social Security check of $2,400. Survival became an immediate, brutal reality. The motel was far too expensive for my non-existent budget, so I spent the next week scouring the classified ads until I found a place I could actually afford. It was a damp, cramped studio apartment on the absolute worst side of town, nestled tightly between a noisy auto repair shop and an abandoned liquor store. The security deposit and the first month of rent took almost my entire first Social Security check. Moving in took less than 5 minutes. I carried my 3 cardboard boxes up 2 flights of rotting wooden stairs and set them on the warped linoleum floor. The apartment smelled strongly of bleach and old cooking grease. The radiator hissed and clattered constantly, offering very little actual heat, and the thin walls provided absolutely no barrier against the wailing police sirens that echoed through the neighborhood every single night. I slept on a cheap air mattress I bought from a discount store, eating canned soup heated over a single electric burner, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. In the long, agonizingly quiet hours of the evening, the isolation was completely deafening. I eventually managed to purchase a cheap, prepaid smartphone just to keep a basic lifeline to the outside world. That tiny, cracked screen became my only window into the life that had been violently stolen from me. Like a man pressing hard on a deep bruise to see how much it hurts, I created a blank, anonymous social media account and searched for my children. The images I saw made my blood boil in my veins. They were not just surviving without me. They were loudly, arrogantly celebrating their newly acquired wealth. Robert posted a glossy video of himself revving the engine of a brand new, bright red Italian sports car, the price tag undoubtedly exceeding $250,000. He captioned it with a boastful quote about the rewards of hard work and corporate leadership. He had never worked a hard day in his entire miserable life. Susan was even worse. She posted dozens of pictures from a lavish weekend party she was hosting at my house, my sanctuary. I recognized the grand marble foyer, the sweeping oak staircase, and the expensive imported rugs I had carefully selected with her mother. In one photograph, Susan was standing by the large custom pool, laughing wildly with a group of strangers, casually pouring a bottle of rare French vintage champagne directly into the water. It was a bottle I had specifically purchased and saved in my private cellar, intending to open it on my 70th birthday. And then there was my brother, Greg. He posted a picture of himself lounging on the deck of a chartered luxury yacht, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth, wearing a customized tailored suit paid for by the sweat of my brow. Watching them carelessly burn through the legacy I had bled for should have broken me completely. It should have sent me spiraling into a deep, unrecoverable depression. But as I sat on my deflated air mattress in that freezing, miserable studio apartment, eating generic chicken noodle soup from a tin can, a profound shift occurred deep inside my soul. The overwhelming sadness began to evaporate. The crippling sense of betrayal and the desperate yearning for my family's love simply burned away, leaving behind absolutely nothing but a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear resolve. They had severely underestimated the man they robbed. They saw a sick, aging father they could easily manipulate and discard. They completely forgot they were dealing with a street fighter who had clawed his way up from the dirt, a man who knew how to build an empire and, more importantly, a man who knew exactly where the weak load-bearing pillars of that empire were hidden. They had all the money, all the vehicles, and the massive estate, but they were completely blind to the highly complex, incredibly fragile vendor contracts that kept the entire business from instantly collapsing inward. A deliberate structural failsafe I had built into the corporate framework a decade ago to protect myself against a hostile board takeover. And as I sat in the dark, listening to a loud domestic dispute echoing from the alleyway below my broken window, I gently pulled a small, worn leather notebook from the bottom of my cardboard box. I began mentally tracing the complicated financial route to a very specific, highly secured offshore entity I had quietly established in a Caribbean banking haven nearly 3 decades prior. It was an invisible safety net containing a modest sum of seed capital that my greedy children and their fancy lawyers had absolutely no idea existed. I was not going to simply survive this. I was going to teach them a lesson about the brutal consequences of absolute greed. And I was going to legally, systematically, and ruthlessly take back every single thing that belonged to me. A massive logistics empire does not truly run on diesel fuel and heavy rubber. It runs entirely on invisible threads of profound personal trust. And my arrogant son was currently taking a blunt machete to every single one of them. The transportation business is a brutal, unforgiving landscape. To the outside world, my company looked like a well-oiled machine of spreadsheets, routing software, and modern warehouses. But the true foundation of my life's work rested on fragile, highly complex vendor relationships that took me decades of firm handshakes and shared hardships to build. I knew the independent fleet owners by their first names. I knew whose wives were sick, whose kids were heading off to college, and who needed a brief extension on their fuel credit during a tough financial quarter. I was the central pillar holding up a massive tent of mutual respect. When Robert and Susan forcefully shoved me out the door, they mistakenly believed they were simply taking over a self-sustaining cash register. They had absolutely no idea they had just inherited a ticking time bomb. Word travels faster than a speeding freight train in this industry. It did not take long for the whispers to reach my cheap prepaid smartphone. Robert, desperate to prove his corporate genius and eager to surround himself with yes-men, began systematically firing my most loyal, veteran operational managers. These were men and women who had bled for the company, who knew exactly how to navigate a catastrophic supply chain failure at 3 a.m. Robert unceremoniously handed them their meager severance packages and immediately replaced them with his inexperienced, smooth-talking friends from his expensive private university. These were boys who wore designer suits to a loading dock and had never once changed a blown tire in the freezing rain. The disaster was immediate and spectacular. Without my veteran managers to shield the fragile network, the new, arrogant administration began treating our long-term vendors like disposable cogs in a machine. They aggressively renegotiated rates, rudely demanded impossible delivery schedules, and, most fatally, began delaying routine payments to cover the massive cash flow they were secretly draining for their personal use. But while Robert was busy throwing lavish parties and tearing down my legacy, I was quietly rebuilding my strength in the shadows. My tiny, miserable studio apartment became my personal training ground. I used the cold, biting anger in my chest as a raw fuel source. Every single morning, long before the sun rose over the gritty city skyline, I forced myself out of bed. I walked for hours through the dangerous, trash-lined streets of my new neighborhood, pushing my recovering body past the point of sheer exhaustion. I bought cheap rubber resistance bands from a discount pharmacy and tied them to the rusted radiator, performing rigorous physical therapy exercises until my muscles screamed. With every grueling step and every painful stretch, the lingering brain fog from the stroke cleared a little more. My physical limp slowly faded, and my mental sharpness returned with a vicious, calculating clarity. I was no longer the disoriented old man trembling in a hospital bed. I was a predator meticulously mapping out his hunting ground, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. To execute a flawless financial execution, however, I needed someone on the inside of the financial world. I needed a loyal ally who possessed the exact same level of ruthless intellect, and I knew exactly who to call. His name was Marcus. He was a brilliant, eccentric forensic accountant I had met nearly 40 years ago during a particularly nasty corporate tax audit. My children always hated Marcus. Susan used to wrinkle her nose in sheer disgust whenever he came over for dinner, complaining that his outdated suits smelled vaguely of mothballs and stale pipe tobacco. Robert routinely dismissed him as a boring, irrelevant bean counter who lacked the aggressive vision needed for modern corporate finance. They treated him like a piece of ugly, invisible furniture. That was their second massive, fatal miscalculation. Marcus was a financial genius. He could look at a massive wall of convoluted corporate ledgers and instantly spot the single, tiny thread that could unravel the entire tapestry. More importantly, Marcus was fiercely, unbreakably loyal to me. I had quietly paid for his daughter's expensive medical treatments 2 decades ago when his own insurance company abandoned him. a private debt of gratitude he swore he would repay until his dying breath. I called Marcus from my prepaid phone and asked him to meet me at a dingy, neon-lit diner a few blocks from my apartment. When he walked through the glass doors, clutching a battered leather briefcase, his eyes widened at the sight of my cheap clothes and the harsh reality of my living conditions. But he did not offer useless pity. He sat down in the cracked vinyl booth, ordered a black coffee, and simply asked what we needed to do. I slid a piece of paper across the sticky table. On it was the exact account number and the complex routing information for the hidden Caribbean offshore entity I had established so many years ago. Marcus adjusted his thick glasses and stared at the numbers. A slow, wicked smile spread across his wrinkled face. He understood instantly. He opened his thick briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavily redacted financial printouts he had quietly pulled from public commercial registries and industry whisper networks. For the next 6 hours, we sat in that grimy diner, fueled by terrible coffee and cold vengeance, dissecting the reckless financial moves my children were making. Marcus showed me exactly how Robert was desperately moving money around, using company assets as collateral to secure wildly risky, high-interest short-term loans. Robert thought he was being a financial wizard, quietly covering up a massive deficit he had created by funneling corporate profits into his private, luxurious accounts. But there was a distinct, terrifying pattern to Robert's mounting debt that Marcus pointed out with a trembling, excited finger. Robert was not borrowing from reputable, traditional banks anymore. He had burned those bridges entirely by defaulting on several minor operational covenants. Instead, my desperate son was quietly signing massive promissory notes with aggressive, secondary private lending firms, the kind of shadowy financial institutions that do not send polite collection letters when you miss a payment. They seize assets instantly and ruthlessly. Marcus tapped the offshore account number I had given him and looked me dead in the eye, asking a question that set the final gears of our trap into motion. He asked if I was truly prepared to completely destroy the very company I had spent my entire adult life building, knowing that the collateral damage would permanently wipe out my family name. I looked down at the cold, bitter coffee in my mug, picturing the 3 cheap cardboard boxes sitting in the freezing rain. I pictured Susan pouring my rare vintage champagne into a swimming pool while I counted pennies to buy canned soup. I pictured my brother Greg smoking a thick cigar on a yacht paid for by my stolen sweat and blood. I looked back up at Marcus and told him to begin the complex legal transfers. The rot had already infected the foundation of the house I built. It was time to lock the heavy doors and strike the match. A man cannot simply burn down his own legacy without first ensuring he holds the absolute legal deed to the ashes. My children were carelessly playing with matches in a house made of dry timber, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that I was the one quietly soaking the floorboards in gasoline. The logistics industry is a hungry beast that must be fed daily with massive amounts of raw cash. Fuel, insurance, payroll, and maintenance do not wait for quarterly projections. They demand immediate, liquid capital. Under my careful watch, the company always maintained a pristine, ironclad reserve fund for these exact daily operations. I never took a single extravagant bonus if it meant a vendor might have to wait an extra week for their check. Robert and Susan possessed absolutely none of my financial discipline. Through the encrypted digital back channels Marcus had masterfully tapped into, I watched in sheer cold disgust as my children bled the corporate accounts dry to fund a lifestyle of grotesque, unearned luxury. Robert purchased a customized twin-engine helicopter, arrogantly registering it as a necessary corporate travel expense. Susan chartered a private jet to Milan for a weekend shopping spree with her sycophantic friends, expensing nearly $200,000 under the vague, laughable guise of international marketing research. Meanwhile, the actual lifeblood of the company was slowly dying of starvation. The independent truckers, the vital diesel fuel suppliers, and the heavy machinery maintenance crews were suddenly receiving standard delay notices instead of their usual prompt payments. Robert's new arrogant management team was forcefully pushing our loyal vendors from immediate payment terms to a suffocating 90-day waiting period. These hard-working men and women operate on razor-thin margins. When a massive logistics firm suddenly stops paying its bills, the vendors panic. To survive, they are forced to sell their unpaid invoices to secondary financial factoring companies at a steep loss, just to get enough cash to keep their own lights on. Robert was creating a massive, toxic ocean of high-interest, short-term debt, completely unaware of the apex predator swimming silently beneath the surface. This was exactly where Marcus and I laid our trap. Marcus began spending his evenings in my squalid, freezing studio apartment. He would sit on a wobbly wooden chair, the harsh glow of his heavy laptop illuminating the peeling yellow wallpaper, while we systematically accessed the Caribbean offshore account I had established 35 years ago. I had initially seeded that hidden account with a modest deposit of $50,000 as a paranoid, ultimate safety net during a particularly volatile economic recession. Through decades of quiet compound interest and aggressive, entirely unmonitored investments managed by a silent offshore broker, that forgotten seed had blossomed into a little over $8 million in untraceable, highly liquid capital. We used a small fraction of those funds to establish a completely anonymous corporate shell entity. We named it Vanguard Horizon Management. It was a perfect ghost. It had no public website, no physical office building, and no smiling employees. It was nothing more than a registered agent in a bleak strip mall in Delaware, and a deeply encrypted bank account routed through 3 different international privacy jurisdictions. On paper, Arthur, the broken, bankrupt father, had absolutely nothing to do with it. Once the legal armor of the shell company was securely in place, Marcus began the surgical strike. Robert, desperately trying to keep the freight trucks fueled while simultaneously hiding his massive embezzlement from the few remaining board members, had quietly started issuing aggressive commercial promissory notes. He was signing predatory, high-yield debt agreements with shadowy secondary lending firms just to cover the company's daily operational bleed. Using Vanguard Horizon Management, Marcus quietly approached these nervous secondary lenders. We offered to buy Robert's highly toxic debt for 80 cents on the dollar, paying them in pure, immediate cash. These lenders, terrified by the glaring, obvious incompetence of my son's new administration, eagerly took our money and ran. Contract by contract, invoice by invoice, I legally purchased the financial noose that was slowly wrapping around my children's necks. In a matter of 6 short weeks, my invisible ghost company became the primary holder of nearly 70% of the logistics empire's outstanding short-term liabilities. I owned the fuel debts. I owned the truck leases. I owned the massive, overdue insurance premiums. But I did not just buy the debt, I bought the leverage. I instructed Marcus to specifically target the secondary contracts that contained a highly aggressive unilateral acceleration clause. It was a brutal piece of financial weaponry. It meant that if Robert missed a single, vital performance metric or delayed a specific payment by even 24 hours, the lender had the absolute legal right to demand the entire principal balance immediately. Robert had blindly signed these clauses in his desperate frenzy for cash, far too arrogant to read the fine print, entirely unaware of the catastrophic legal bomb lying dormant beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. The trigger was set, and my finger was resting firmly on the button, waiting for the perfect, agonizing moment to push it. The level of profound self-control required to execute this phase of the plan was agonizing. I was sitting on millions of dollars of absolute corporate power, holding the legal right to crush my enemies. Yet I was still living like a destitute ghost in the absolute worst slum in the city. The brutal winter set in, pushing freezing drafts through the cracked window of my apartment. I slept under 3 thin, cheap blankets, wearing a wool hat indoors just to retain my body heat. I ate generic oatmeal boiled on a single, temperamental electric burner. Every single time a police siren wailed through the alleyway below, or a drunken fight broke out in the neighboring apartment, I had to physically clench my fists to stop myself from marching down to my old corporate headquarters and screaming my lungs out. The psychological warfare of poverty is exhausting. It wears down your dignity and chips away at your sanity. I would sit in the dark, my breath visible in the freezing room, staring at my cheap prepaid smartphone. I watched Susan post a glowing, high-definition photograph of herself wearing a stunning, custom-made diamond necklace at a charity gala. A piece of jewelry worth more than the entire crumbling apartment building I was currently shivering inside. I watched Greg boast about his new executive corner office, posting pictures of his expensive imported cigars resting on the exact mahogany desk where I had once suffered my stroke. They thought they had won. They truly believed I was rotting away in some forgotten, miserable corner of the world, too weak and broken to ever challenge their stolen throne. But every time the bitter cold threatened to break my spirit, I would look over at the thick stack of legally binding contracts sitting on my cheap kitchen counter. I would read my son's hasty, messy signature at the bottom of a promissory note worth $3 million. I would trace the ink with my finger, feeling a deep, radiating warmth spread through my chest that no expensive heater could ever provide. I did not feel sorry for them anymore. I did not mourn the loss of my family, because the monsters wearing my children's faces were not family at all. They were thieves who had invaded my sanctuary, and I was going to surgically remove them. I just smiled a cold, hard, genuine smile in the freezing dark. I owned the diamond necklace Susan was wearing. I owned the custom helicopter Robert was flying. I owned the very ground they walked on and the roof over their treacherous heads. They were completely, irrevocably mine. They just had not received the formal eviction notice yet. And as Robert prepared to make the most spectacularly stupid financial decision of his entire miserable life, to cover up a massive quarterly deficit, I knew my long, freezing nights in the shadows were finally coming to a very explosive end. A sudden plunge into freezing water is a terrifying shock to the system. But the true panic only sets in when you look up and realize the surface is sealed beneath 6 inches of solid ice. My son was finally running out of financial oxygen, and I was the invisible architect who had frozen the entire lake. For agonizing months, Robert had been playing a reckless, arrogant game of corporate musical chairs, moving massive sums of money from one bleeding department to another just to keep the music playing. But the music finally stopped on a bleak Tuesday morning. Through the encrypted digital back channels Marcus continuously monitored, we watched the exact moment the corporate operating accounts hit a hard, unforgiving wall. A major regional fuel supplier, tired of Robert's endless, empty promises and suffocating 90-day delays, abruptly cut off the credit line for our entire East Coast freight division. Within 48 hours, 70 massive commercial delivery trucks were parked motionless on the shoulders of the interstate, their heavy diesel engines dead, their highly lucrative cargo completely stranded. The sheer, unadulterated panic inside my former mahogany executive suite must have been absolutely deafening. A smart, capable, and seasoned leader would have immediately recognized the fatal errors. A real leader would have grounded the ridiculous corporate helicopter, sold the imported Italian sports cars, slashed all executive salaries to zero, and begged the veteran operational managers to return to save the core business. But my children were not leaders. They were entitled, fragile parasites who viewed any form of personal sacrifice as a direct insult to their manufactured status. Instead of aggressively scaling back their luxurious lifestyles, they desperately sought a massive infusion of raw cash to plug a gaping hole the size of a sunken battleship. Interestingly, my brother Greg had completely stopped posting boastful pictures from his corner office, quietly and rapidly transferring his personal assets into an untraceable spousal trust, signaling that the smart rats were already preparing to abandon ship long before the arrogant captain even smelled the thick smoke. With their traditional credit lines entirely exhausted and reputable commercial banks refusing to touch their highly toxic, bleeding ledgers, Robert and Susan turned their greedy eyes toward the single most valuable, completely unencumbered asset they possessed. The family mansion, my beautiful, sprawling, meticulously landscaped estate. I had proudly paid off the primary mortgage 20 years ago, leaving it entirely free and clear of any banking obligations. To my children, it was not a cherished home filled with warm memories of their late mother. It was simply a massive, dormant cash machine waiting to be violently cracked open. They needed exactly $5 million in immediate, liquid capital to satisfy the angry fuel vendors and prevent a catastrophic, highly public breach of contract with our largest international shipping clients. They eagerly approached a notorious private lending firm downtown, an aggressive, hard money outfit famous for writing massive checks to desperate, wealthy fools at outright extortionate interest rates. These were predatory corporate sharks who demanded total, unconditional collateral and took immense, gleeful pride in swift, ruthless foreclosures. Marcus and I sat in my freezing, damp studio apartment, staring intently at the glowing screen of his heavy laptop as the digital confirmation of their meeting came through our secure server. I could vividly picture Robert sitting in that plush, oversized downtown conference room, nervously adjusting his designer silk tie, desperately trying to project an aura of temporary corporate restructuring rather than total, undeniable financial ruin. I could clearly picture Susan sitting right beside him, rolling her eyes, profoundly annoyed that signing highly complex legal paperwork was cutting into her expensive afternoon spa appointment. They were blindly, arrogantly signing away the very roof over their heads, treating a $5 million secondary mortgage with a punishing 18% interest rate like a minor, irritating administrative errand. There was a seemingly standard, highly complex cross-default provision buried deeply on page 47 of that massive loan agreement, a tiny legal mechanism Susan entirely ignored while admiring her manicured nails, which I had personally ensured was worded with lethal, uncompromising precision. They walked out of that towering glass building firmly believing they had successfully bought themselves another full year of luxurious breathing room. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted the unforgiving financial market. They had absolutely no idea that 2 short weeks prior, Marcus had discovered exactly which lending firm Robert was desperately courting. Using the vast, untraceable liquid resources of my offshore shell company, Vanguard Horizon Management, I had quietly executed a hostile, highly lucrative buyout of that exact private lending institution. The hard money lenders had been facing a severe, quiet liquidity crisis of their own due to a series of terrible commercial real estate bets, and I swooped in, bought their outstanding debt, and legally absorbed their entire portfolio under my anonymous corporate umbrella. When Robert confidently dragged his expensive gold fountain pen across the final signature line of that heavy mortgage contract, he was not borrowing $5 million from a group of faceless, predatory corporate bankers. He was borrowing my own stolen money directly from me. The legal title to my magnificent family estate, the very house they had maliciously locked me out of while I was recovering from a crippling neurological event, was now legally bound, completely tethered, and unconditionally mortgaged to the destitute old man shivering in a squalid apartment on the absolute worst side of town. I stared silently at the crisp, digital copy of the fully executed contract Marcus had routed to our secure, encrypted monitor. Seeing my son's arrogant, looping signature legally binding his entire false empire to my hidden terms sent a wave of profound, intoxicating warmth right through my tired, aging bones. I slowly stood up from my wobbly wooden chair, walked over to the cracked window of my cramped studio, and looked out at the freezing rain washing heavily over the flickering neon signs of the abandoned liquor store across the street. For the very first time since the devastating evening they left me with 3 flimsy cardboard boxes on the wet concrete, I did not feel a single, fleeting ounce of sorrow or betrayal. I did not mourn the family I had lost, because the individuals sleeping in my beds and driving my vehicles were merely thieves wearing familiar masks. Standing there in the bitter cold, I felt only the terrifying, deeply serene calm of absolute, unshakable control. The massive, rusted steel jaws of my financial trap had just violently snapped shut directly around their ankles. All I had to do now was slowly, methodically begin pulling the heavy iron chain. The most dangerous predator is not the one that roars before it strikes. It is the one that patiently waits until its prey takes a deep, comfortable breath before violently tightening the coil. My children had just inhaled their final, arrogant breath of stolen luxury, and it was time for me to squeeze the life out of their false empire. With Vanguard Horizon Management fully weaponized, I gave Marcus the green light to initiate the financial slaughter. Up until this precise moment, my children had been drowning slowly, taking on water one unpaid invoice at a time. I decided it was time to blow a massive, unrepairable hole directly through the hull of their sinking ship. Marcus sat at his computer in my freezing apartment, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he systematically activated the unilateral acceleration clauses on every single piece of commercial debt we had secretly purchased. We did not ask for the standard monthly minimums. We did not offer a polite grace period or a friendly corporate restructuring meeting. We legally and ruthlessly demanded the immediate total repayment of the principal balances, all at the exact same time. The shockwave hit my former corporate headquarters like a devastating earthquake. On a crisp Thursday morning, right around 9 o'clock, the digital walls simply caved in, because Vanguard Horizon Management now controlled over 70% of their short-term liabilities. Our synchronized demand for immediate payment triggered automatic security freezes across all of their remaining operational bank accounts. The chaos that erupted was beautiful, terrible, and entirely of their own making. Without access to liquid capital, the massive logistics machine ground to a violent, screeching halt. I sat in my dingy apartment, listening to the police scanner and reading the frantic industry message boards. Heavy commercial tow trucks, dispatched by the aggressive collection agencies we had retained, began arriving at our regional distribution centers under the cover of darkness. They bypassed the screaming, confused warehouse managers and legally hooked up 30 of our newest, most expensive freight trucks, hauling them away into the night as seized collateral. The automated diesel fuel pumps at our private terminals were electronically shut off by the vendors. The sprawling loading docks went pitch black, while Robert scrambled frantically to discover which phantom corporate conglomerate was orchestrating this synchronized massacre. He remained completely oblivious to the far more devastating personal blow I had meticulously timed for the exact same week. I needed to see the panic in their eyes. I needed a tangible, physical confirmation that the arrogant fortress they had built on my broken back was truly crumbling. I knew my brother Greg's daily routine perfectly. Every single afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, he left his unearned corner office to purchase a $12 imported espresso at a high-end, glass-walled cafe downtown. I dug through my cardboard boxes and put on my most pathetic, worn-out clothing. A frayed, stained winter jacket, scuffed leather shoes with thinning soles, and a cheap plastic cane I had used during my initial stroke recovery. I wanted to look exactly like the broken, defeated ghost they believed they had created. I walked into that pristine, brightly lit cafe, leaning heavily on the cheap cane, my hands shaking with a perfectly practiced, exaggerated tremor. Greg was standing near the pickup counter, wearing a bespoke, tailored gray suit, laughing loudly with a young female barista. I shuffled slowly across the polished tile floor and stood right beside him. I quietly said his name. Greg turned around, his smug smile instantly melting into a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked around the crowded, wealthy cafe, profoundly terrified that one of his affluent new friends might associate him with the wretched, homeless-looking man standing inches away. He aggressively grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back exit, his expensive cologne turning my empty stomach. He hissed at me, demanding to know what I was doing there and threatening to call the corporate security team. I kept my head down, forcing my voice to crack and tremble. I told him my heating bill was 3 months past due, that the winter wind was blowing through my cracked window, and I just needed a few dollars to buy a warm bowl of soup. I begged him, my own flesh and blood, for the loose change in his pocket. The sheer disgust on his face was a masterpiece of human cruelty. He did not ask about my health. He did not ask where I was living. He hurriedly reached into his slim designer wallet, pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill, and forcefully shoved it into my trembling hand. He leaned in close and viciously whispered that I was a pathetic embarrassment, that the company was his now, and that if I ever showed my face in public around him again, he would have me legally restrained. Then, he practically sprinted out the back door, leaving his expensive espresso sitting abandoned on the counter. I stood alone in the cold alleyway, gripping that crisp $20 bill. I slowly dropped the exaggerated tremor. I straightened my back, the cheap cane resting lightly on the pavement. I started to laugh, a deep, resonant, echoing laugh that startled a flock of pigeons resting on the nearby fire escape. Greg thought he was buying his way out of an uncomfortable family encounter, completely unaware that the very foundation of his hidden spousal trust was already fatally compromised by the financial contagion I had unleashed. That $20 bill was the very last piece of my money he would ever touch, because the true killing blow was scheduled for the first day of the month. When Robert and Susan signed that disastrous $5 million secondary mortgage on the family mansion, they banked heavily on the company's monthly cash flow to cover the massive, punishing interest payments. But Vanguard Horizon Management had just frozen every single corporate account and halted all incoming revenue streams. They had absolutely no liquid cash left anywhere. The first day of the month arrived, cold and entirely unforgiving. Marcus and I sat in silence, watching the secure banking portal on his laptop screen. The deadline for the first major mortgage payment was exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. If they missed it, the aggressively worded cross-default provision on page 47, the exact clause Susan had completely ignored while admiring her manicured nails, would instantly activate. It explicitly stated that a failure to pay the mortgage would immediately trigger a total, incurable default, granting the lender the absolute legal right to seize the property without a standard 90-day grace period. 4 o'clock passed. Robert's personal bank accounts, which Marcus was quietly monitoring through encrypted back channels, were completely overdrawn. Susan's elite credit cards were rapidly maxing out as she desperately tried to liquidate her designer wardrobe online, just to make the minimum payments on her luxury cars. 4:55. The digital clock on the laptop screen ticked downward, heavy and loud in the silent, freezing apartment. 5 o'clock. The payment portal remained completely, gloriously empty. Marcus looked up at me, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in his thick glasses, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. They had missed the payment. The 24-hour grace period they thought they had was a complete, deliberate illusion. The legal trap had snapped firmly shut, severing the final, fragile thread holding their stolen life together. With a few swift, precise keystrokes, Marcus generated the formal, legally binding notice of default. It was a cold, clinical document that completely stripped my ungrateful children of their remaining dignity and formally initiated the aggressive foreclosure process on the massive estate they had stolen from me. I leaned back in my wobbly wooden chair, listening to the hissing radiator, and finally allowed myself to feel the absolute, magnificent warmth of impending justice. Gravity is a ruthless teacher, and when a structure built entirely on arrogance finally gives way, the descent is both deafening and absolute. The false empire my children had violently stolen from me was no longer just cracking. It was actively tearing itself apart at the seams. Within 48 hours of Vanguard Horizon Management triggering the massive, synchronized security freezes across all their operational accounts, the once mighty logistics company officially bled to death. The sprawling regional distribution centers, usually humming constantly with the loud roar of heavy diesel engines and shouting dock foremen, went completely, eerily silent. Massive, hardened steel padlocks were chained tightly to the heavy iron gates. Our most loyal, veteran truck drivers simply walked away from their stranded vehicles, leaving fully loaded trailers sitting idle on the shoulders of the interstate. The massive international shipping clients, furious over the sudden, catastrophic delays, instantly filed multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuits, effectively burying the company under a mountain of inescapable legal fire. The local newspapers caught wind of the spectacular, unprecedented disaster almost immediately. On a crisp Sunday morning, I walked down to the grimy corner bodega near my apartment and bought a copy of the City Tribune with my spare change. There it was, printed in bold, unforgiving black ink across the front page of the business section. A massive, highly profitable local logistics titan officially filing for total liquidation bankruptcy. The extensive article detailed a shocking tale of profound corporate mismanagement, highlighting the staggering, reckless incompetence of the newly appointed executive board. Robert's pristine, carefully manufactured reputation as a brilliant, modern business mind was publicly and permanently incinerated for the entire city to witness. He was exposed not as a visionary leader, but as a fraudulent, entitled parasite who had crashed a beautifully engineered machine straight into a brick wall. The true, unadulterated panic inside the family mansion must have reached a suffocating fever pitch. With the business completely dead, the corporate income permanently severed, and the massive 18% secondary mortgage in total, incurable default. Robert and Susan were suddenly staring directly down the barrel of immediate homelessness. I sat at my small, wobbly kitchen table, sipping generic hot tea, as Marcus calmly relayed their desperate, frantic movements through his secure, encrypted digital network. Robert desperately tried to sell his customized twin-engine helicopter to an exclusive private aviation broker, hoping to generate enough emergency cash to satisfy the aggressive lenders and halt the impending foreclosure. But he was hit with a catastrophic, wall-shattering reality check. The broker coldly informed him that a massive, ironclad legal lien had already been placed on the aircraft by an anonymous corporate entity called Vanguard Horizon Management. Robert screamed at the broker, threatening massive legal retaliation, completely failing to understand that he had willingly signed the very contracts authorizing those exact liens. Susan experienced the exact same horrifying realization when she attempted to quietly auction off her fleet of imported luxury vehicles and her massive, insured collection of designer diamond jewelry. Every single high-end pawn shop and private buyer she contacted ran a routine background check, only to discover that every single extravagant toy she possessed was legally frozen. They were completely boxed in. They were trapped inside a multi-million-dollar prison of their own making, entirely unable to post bail, securely locked down by the very ghost company they had foolishly sold their souls to just weeks prior. The absolute pinnacle of their profound public humiliation arrived on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning, perfectly mirroring the exact same miserable weather they had forced me out into months ago. I did not need Marcus to pull up security footage to witness this particular moment. I could feel the sheer, poetic justice radiating through my tired bones. A grim, heavily built county process server drove a plain white municipal sedan right up to the tall wrought iron gates of my sprawling estate. Because the aggressive cross-default provision had instantly stripped away their standard legal protections and standard grace periods, the server did not simply leave a polite, sealed letter in the brass mailbox. He aggressively bypassed the security keypad, walked straight up the long, pristine cobblestone driveway, and marched heavily onto the grand white columns of the front porch. With a heavy industrial steel staple gun, he violently fastened a bright, fluorescent pink notice of public foreclosure directly onto the beautiful, custom oak front doors. It was a massive, glaring beacon of total financial failure. It was highly visible from the street, positioned perfectly for all their wealthy, highly judgmental neighbors to see as they walked their pedigree dogs past the estate. The protective, arrogant bubble of their fake reality was violently burst, replaced by a harsh, neon sign advertising their utter, undeniable ruin to the entire world. Later that evening, as the brutal reality of the pink notice finally settled over their echoing, freezing mansion, my cheap prepaid smartphone began to vibrate furiously on the chipped kitchen counter. I stared down at the cracked screen. The caller identification displayed Robert's private cellular number, followed shortly by Susan's. I did not answer the phone. I simply let the desperate calls roll over to the automated voicemail system, calmly pouring myself another cup of hot tea while the tiny recording light blinked red in the dark apartment. When the frantic ringing finally stopped entirely, I pressed the loudspeaker button and listened to the glorious, unhinged symphony of their absolute despair. Robert's voice echoed harshly through my damp, cramped studio apartment, tight with profound panic and seething, toxic anger. He did not apologize for stealing my life's work. He did not express a single, fleeting ounce of genuine regret for leaving me entirely bankrupt in the street. Instead, he hysterically blamed the shifting economy. He aggressively blamed the disloyal vendors for abandoning him. And he furiously cursed the mysterious, predatory executives at Vanguard Horizon Management who were actively, purposefully destroying his life. He sounded exactly like a terrified, spoiled little boy who had just realized the monsters hiding under his bed were completely real and incredibly hungry. Susan's voicemail was a masterpiece of pathetic, selfish desperation. She was sobbing hysterically, the sharp sound of shattered glass echoing loudly in the background. She viciously blamed Robert for his sheer, unmitigated stupidity, completely ignoring her own massive role in the corporate theft and her reckless, extravagant spending. Then, in a twist of breathtaking, unbelievable audacity, she begged me to somehow fix the massive disaster. She pleaded with the father she had callously discarded and left to rot, demanding that I call my old, powerful banking contacts to magically save her beautiful home from being publicly auctioned off on the courthouse steps. She genuinely wanted the broken, impoverished old man to miraculously resurrect the very protective shield she had violently ripped away from him. I sat alone in the freezing dark, listening to their frantic, weeping voices looping over and over again, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical satisfaction. They were entirely broken, screaming helplessly into a massive void they had eagerly dug with their own greedy, entitled hands. But the magnificent performance was not quite over. As I permanently deleted their pathetic voicemails from the cheap phone, I walked over to the small closet in the corner of the room. I carefully unzipped a protective plastic garment bag and pulled out the single, immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit I had meticulously saved from the wreckage of my old life. I began to carefully iron the crisp white shirt, knowing that the final act of this tragedy required a very specific, highly personal audience. They were about to lose the house at a brutal public auction, but they had absolutely no idea who was holding the golden gavel, waiting patiently in the bright morning light to strike the final, devastating blow. A public financial execution does not require a heavy iron guillotine or a blindfold. Sometimes, all it takes is a bright morning sun, a stern man with a wooden clipboard, and the cold concrete steps of a county courthouse. The day of the massive property auction arrived with a crisp, biting winter chill that felt perfectly designed to violently clear away the suffocating fog of the past few agonizing months. I stood in front of the cracked, heavily stained mirror in my miserable studio apartment for the very last time. I carefully unzipped the protective plastic garment bag and slipped my arms into the custom-tailored charcoal suit. I deliberately buttoned the crisp, heavily starched white shirt and tied my dark silk tie with firm, incredibly steady hands that no longer held a single, lingering trace of the neurological tremor my greedy children had so eagerly capitalized on. I stepped firmly into my polished leather Oxfords, the familiar, expensive weight grounding me instantly to the undeniable reality of who I truly was. I looked down at the cheap, plastic medical cane leaning against the peeling yellow wallpaper near the door. I did not need it. I had never truly needed it after the first few grueling months of physical therapy, but I had weaponized my own perceived weakness to lull my enemies into a profound, arrogant slumber. I left the ugly plastic cane resting right there in the squalor, a silent monument to the broken, defeated old man who had died in this freezing room. And I walked out the door as the absolute architect of their total destruction. I took a commercial cab to the bustling center of the city, explicitly instructing the driver to drop me off 2 massive blocks away from the sprawling municipal courthouse. I wanted to walk the final distance. I wanted to feel the cold, hard pavement under my polished shoes, matching the steady, relentless, thundering rhythm of my own beating heart. As the massive, imposing limestone pillars of the courthouse came into clear view, I saw a small, highly scattered crowd gathering near the bottom of the wide stone steps. These were the ruthless bottom feeders of the commercial real estate world, aggressive property flippers, wealthy bargain hunters, and curious local onlookers waiting patiently for the morning list of distressed assets to be publicly liquidated. And standing right in the absolute center of that miserable, shivering cluster, completely exposed to the harsh elements and the highly judgmental eyes of the public, were my 2 children and my treacherous brother. They looked absolutely wretched. The glossy, highly manufactured sheen of their stolen wealth had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, unadulterated panic. Robert was wearing a wrinkled, highly expensive designer suit, but his silk tie was pulled loosely and erratically away from his neck, and thick, heavy beads of nervous sweat were visibly gathering on his forehead despite the biting winter cold. He was frantically pacing back and forth on the concrete, holding his expensive cellular phone tightly to his ear, desperately leaving voicemails for wealthy country club acquaintances who were actively, purposefully screening his pathetic calls. Susan stood rigidly beside him, her arms crossed tightly over a thin, useless luxury coat, her face partially hidden behind massive, dark designer sunglasses. But I could clearly see the aggressive, terrified tension in her jaw and the way she physically flinched every single time a stranger walked past her. Greg was hovering nervously a few feet away from them, creating a distinct, deliberate physical distance. He looked profoundly terrified, constantly checking his expensive gold watch, violently realizing that the protective corporate umbrella he had cowardly hidden under for a decade was entirely, permanently gone. I deliberately adjusted the stiff cuffs of my crisp white shirt, took a massive, deep breath of the freezing morning air, and began my ascent up the wide concrete steps. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, terrifying, highly measured pace of a man who legally owns the very ground he steps on. Greg was the very first one to spot me. He was anxiously scanning the busy city street for a miraculous financial savior when his eyes abruptly locked onto mine. His mouth fell open in a silent, highly dramatic gasp. He physically stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a cold stone pillar, his face instantly draining of all color as if he had just seen a genuine, horrifying apparition stepping out of a grave. His sudden, highly clumsy movement caught Robert's frantic attention. Robert slowly lowered his cellular phone, turning his head to see exactly what had terrified his uncle so profoundly. When Robert and Susan finally saw me, the sheer, paralyzing shock that violently washed over their faces was worth every single agonizing night I had spent shivering in that damp, horrible apartment. They were fully expecting to see the destitute, trembling, homeless ghost they had so easily dismissed and humiliated in the coffee shop just weeks prior. Instead, they were staring directly at the formidable, unyielding patriarch who had built a massive commercial logistics empire from absolute scratch. I stood incredibly tall, my broad shoulders squared, my beautifully tailored suit fitting perfectly, radiating an aura of total, absolute command. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them. I did not say a single, solitary word. I simply looked at them with eyes as hard and uncompromising as shattered glass. Susan let out a pathetic, highly stifled whimper, her manicured hands flying up rapidly to cover her mouth. Robert took an incredibly shaky step forward, his voice cracking violently as he awkwardly stammered out my name, his arrogant, deeply entitled brain completely failing to comprehend the impossible, terrifying transformation standing right in front of him. Before my son could even formulate a coherent sentence, a heavy, electronically amplified voice echoed loudly across the stone plaza. The official county auctioneer, a stern, unsmiling man holding a thick wooden clipboard, stepped aggressively up to the brass podium at the top of the stairs. He sharply tapped the microphone, demanding immediate, total silence from the scattered crowd. He loudly cleared his throat and officially announced the formal commencement of the morning foreclosure proceedings. He aggressively read the formal, highly detailed legal description of the massive, multi-million-dollar estate. He methodically listed the sprawling acreage, the expensive custom architectural details, the imported marble foyer, and the magnificent custom pool where my daughter had so carelessly poured my rare vintage champagne, with every single highly descriptive word echoing off the cold limestone walls. The brutal, undeniable reality of their situation physically crushed my children. Robert desperately scanned the faces in the small crowd one final, highly agonizing time. He was frantically looking for a savior. He was desperately praying for one of his arrogant, wealthy private school friends or a slick corporate associate to miraculously step forward and place a massive bid to save his stolen kingdom. But absolutely no one stepped forward. The financial contagion I had deliberately unleashed through the local media had completely obliterated their social capital. Their former wealthy friends now treated them like a highly infectious, toxic disease. They were entirely, hopelessly alone on those cold steps. As the stern auctioneer forcefully prepared to open the massive bidding process, I casually reached a hand inside the breast pocket of my charcoal jacket, my fingers brushing against the heavy, notarized legal document Marcus had meticulously prepared for me the night before, a piece of paper that guaranteed the absolute impossibility of their last-minute salvation. And as Robert choked back a loud sob of pure defeat, he completely failed to notice the highly specific, terrifying legal parameter the auctioneer was just about to announce regarding the exact ownership of the catastrophic debt. A public auction is not merely a financial transaction. It is a highly visible, incredibly brutal autopsy of a massive corporate corpse, and I was the invisible coroner holding the sharpest scalpel. The cold morning wind whipped violently across the limestone steps as the stern auctioneer adjusted his thick glasses, heavily cleared his throat, and looked down at the official legal paperwork resting on his brass podium. He announced in a booming, electronically amplified voice that the property was being aggressively liquidated to satisfy a massive, completely defaulted secondary mortgage held exclusively by Vanguard Horizon Management. The small, shivering crowd murmured quietly, breath visible in the freezing air, waiting eagerly for the bidding frenzy to begin on a multi-million-dollar estate. But the auctioneer aggressively raised his hand, demanding total silence. He stated firmly that due to a highly unusual, legally binding stipulation filed directly by the primary lien holder, this specific auction would not operate under standard municipal procedures. Because Vanguard Horizon Management owned the absolute entirety of the toxic debt, the anonymous corporate entity possessed the undeniable legal right to dictate the absolute minimum opening bid. I watched Robert closely. He was desperately wiping thick, nervous sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand, completely oblivious to the massive, invisible anvil hanging directly over his head by a single, fraying thread. He actually stepped forward, pulling his slim designer wallet from his pocket, falsely believing that if the starting bid was low enough, he could somehow scrape together enough cash from his maxed-out credit lines to miraculously save his stolen kingdom. The auctioneer looked directly at Robert, his face a mask of complete, professional indifference, and announced the mandatory opening bid. Exactly $1. A profound, absolutely stunned silence violently struck the entire courthouse plaza. Even the busy city traffic seemed to quiet down for a fleeting moment. Robert let out a loud, breathless laugh, a manic sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He aggressively shoved his way to the very front of the small crowd, waving a crisp $100 bill in the freezing air, arrogantly shouting his bid to the auctioneer. He genuinely believed it was a clerical error, a miraculous stroke of unbelievable luck bestowed upon a man who thought he was entirely untouchable. But the stern auctioneer did not acknowledge Robert's frantic shouting. He coldly shook his head and slammed his hand against the podium. He announced that under the strict, heavily notarized parameters of the foreclosure, Vanguard Horizon Management had legally invoked an absolute right of first refusal, utilizing a registered corporate proxy to execute the transaction. I slowly walked up the remaining concrete steps, stepping right past my trembling son. I calmly reached into the breast pocket of my custom-tailored charcoal suit and pulled out the heavy, legally embossed proxy document Marcus had meticulously prepared the night before. I handed it directly to the auctioneer. He carefully inspected the raised corporate seals, verified my personal identification, and gave a sharp, definitive nod of approval. He turned back to the stunned crowd, entirely ignoring Robert's rising, hysterical protests. With a voice as calm and terrifying as a frozen, bottomless lake, I looked the auctioneer dead in the eye and formally placed my bid. $1. The heavy wooden gavel violently struck the brass sounding block. It was the single loudest, most magnificent, and deeply satisfying sound I have ever heard in my entire 68 years of existence. Sold. To the official proxy of Vanguard Horizon Management. The immediate aftermath was a masterpiece of absolute, paralyzing horror. Robert's arrogant brain finally, violently connected the massive, terrifying dots. He stared wildly at my tailored suit, then at the official paperwork resting on the podium, and finally at my completely unyielding face. His jaw slackened, and his breathing became shallow and erratic. He stammered frantically, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine, desperately demanding to know how I could possibly represent the massive corporate conglomerate that had systematically destroyed his life. Susan let out a loud, highly dramatic wail of pure agony, physically collapsing onto her knees on the cold concrete steps. She buried her face in her hands, her expensive designer sunglasses clattering loudly against the stone, completely ruining her heavy makeup as the undeniable reality of immediate homelessness crushed her fragile ego. Greg simply backed away, his face pale and sick, furiously pressing his back against the limestone pillar as if he were trying to physically melt into the architecture and disappear from my wrath. I took one slow, deliberate step toward my broken son. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout in anger. I spoke with the hushed, terrifying clarity of total, absolute victory. I calmly explained to him that there was no massive corporate conglomerate. There were no mysterious, ruthless executives sitting in a glass high-rise plotting his downfall. Vanguard Horizon Management was a complete ghost, a brilliant legal fiction funded entirely by a hidden, forgotten offshore account I had quietly opened over 3 decades ago. I watched the last remaining shreds of his sanity snap as I systematically explained how I used his own reckless arrogance against him. I told him how I legally purchased his massive, toxic commercial debt for absolute pennies on the dollar because his new vendors thought he was a profound, irredeemable idiot. I watched his eyes widen in sheer terror as I revealed the final, devastating masterstroke. I was the one who bought the predatory lending firm he foolishly mortgaged my home to. I was his aggressive lender. I was his ruthless executioner. And I had just legally purchased my magnificent family estate back from his greedy, entitled hands for exactly $1 single. I turned my cold gaze down to Susan, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the ground. I calmly reminded her of the rare, highly expensive vintage champagne she had so callously poured into my swimming pool while I was shivering under 3 thin blankets in a freezing damp apartment, eating cheap canned soup. I told her that her designer wardrobe and her luxury vehicles were permanently seized, and that she would never see a single dime of my money for the rest of her miserable life. Finally, I slowly walked over to my treacherous brother. Greg was violently trembling, a pathetic shell of the arrogant executive he had pretended to be. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out the exact same crisp, folded $20 bill he had viciously shoved into my hands in the coffee shop alleyway. I casually dropped it onto the freezing stone steps right at his expensive leather shoes. I told him he had exactly 1 hour to use that money to secure a cheap taxi, because the county sheriff was already en route to the estate to forcefully execute a highly public, entirely legal eviction. I did not wait for their pathetic apologies. I did not listen to their hysterical, weeping pleas for mercy. I simply turned my back on them forever and walked slowly down the courthouse steps. The heavy winter clouds finally broke apart, and the bright, warm morning sun washed over my face. I left them standing there in the biting cold, completely stripped of their false dignity, holding absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of their own catastrophic greed. Later that evening, I sat alone in my familiar, expansive mahogany study. The massive house was completely, blissfully silent. The cheap cardboard boxes were gone forever, burned in the massive stone fireplace. My beautiful sanctuary was mine again, entirely free and clear, permanently cleansed of the toxic rot that had infected it. The legacy I had bled for was secure. I slowly poured myself a glass of rare, aged bourbon, raised it to the empty, quiet room, and savored the profound, lasting peace of absolute, legally binding justice. Thank you for listening to my story. If this meticulous journey of ultimate, undeniable karma resonated with your soul, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video. Leave a comment below with the word justice so I know you stand firmly with me against toxic greed. And please, do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more viewers who appreciate watching arrogant betrayal get exactly what it deserves.